Earlier this month, the Department of Education suddenly stopped trying to overturn a bankruptcy court victory for a struggling student loan borrower after the Daily Poster's reporting on the case went viral. But there are still dozens of cases where the Biden administration is fighting federal student loan borrowers who are trying to eradicate their debts through bankruptcy. This is according to court records reviewed by the Daily Poster. Reporter at the Daily Poster, Julia Rock, joins us now to discuss. Welcome, Julia.
Thanks for having me.
So do you think there was a connection between the reporting and the decision to kind of let this one go?
What I would say is that there's a pretty strong movement among student debtors calling on the Biden administration to cancel student debt. And I think that their frustration in response to our reporting was probably what prompted the withdrawal of the appeals.
And can you lay out for people watching who are like, wait a minute, I can do what? How could I get out from under this crushing burden? You lay out what are the laws around bankruptcy and student debt at this point?
Yes, so student debt cannot be discharged through traditional means in bankruptcy court. People who are filing for bankruptcy must go through a separate proceeding to have student debt discharged. That's because of laws that have been on the books for a few decades, including a 2005 law that then Senator Joe Biden supported, exempting private student debt from bankruptcy. So people trying to file for bankruptcy must meet a higher standard to have their student debt discharged. That standard is undue hardship. So people must prove that their student debt is causing undue hardship in order to have it discharged through bankruptcy. That's a nearly impossible legal standard to meet and is made much more challenging by the fact that most student debtors undergoing these proceedings are representing themselves. They're pro se, whereas they're coming up against, the United States Department of Justice. And those lawyers are writing long briefs, citing lots of legal precedent, trying to prevent people from having their debt discharged.
Now, what's the difference between due hardship and undue hardship? Is due hardship kind of hardship that you brought on yourself by taking out loans, and undue hardship would be you kind of got scammed into taking a loan? In other words, do you have to prove like some type of fraud in order to go from due to undue suffering?
No, actually, how that legal standard has been interpreted by the courts, it's been interpreted in a number of different ways, but you'll see federal judges writing in their decisions in these bankruptcy cases that people have to meet a standard like, I think it's a certainty of hopelessness. So there's just no chance they're ever going to pay back, or they have to prove that it is so disabling them in their lives that, they can't go forward without having the debt discharged. So the courts have interpreted that standard to mean a number of different things, but sort of the gist is that the interpretations by the federal courts of this standard has created a really high bar for having the debt discharged.
You'd think, and look, I'm not actually the most sympathetic person to the kind of student loan debt forgiveness movement more generally, but you'd think if the Biden administration wanted to do something about this and has decided they're not going to do the loan forgiveness they kind of promised and a lot of progressives expected, well, then one almost easier thing they could do would be to just stop fighting these kinds of cases, and they could count that as a win, without getting into, like, that's within their power. They don't have to do the kind of thornier thing.
Absolutely. And it's important to point out I think in any year over the past 2 decades, there haven't been more than like 100 of these cases. There actually aren't very many people who will even try to have their student debt discharged through bankruptcy because of what I was saying before. It's such a high legal standard. And you can imagine if you're going through bankruptcy, you can't afford a fancy lawyer. So I think the bigger point here is that if the administration came forward and said, we're not going to fight your case in bankruptcy court, if you meet these certain standards, then a lot more people would probably come forward and try to have their debt discharged. But right now, it's a pretty small universe of cases.
And close to 16,000 federal student loan borrowers who were misled by for-profit colleges will have $415 million in debts erased, according to the U.S. Department of Education. These borrowers, including approximately 1,800 students who attended Devry University, will receive relief through borrower defense, which, according to NPR, is a legal provision that promises loan relief for defrauded borrowers. How does this decision fit into the broader context of the student loan debate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that on the one hand, these for-profit schools have defrauded many students and have also been drivers of the student debt crisis over the past couple of decades. Enrollment at these for-profit schools has also increased during the pandemic because of, the typical flexibility of their online options. What I will say going through these court filings is that there are cases where people who attended for-profit schools that were later shut down have filed, for relief through bankruptcy if they didn't attend those schools, within the window that they got automatic loan forgiveness. And the Biden Education Department is still fighting borrowers in those cases. So I think it's an important step forward to acknowledge that for-profit schools have been a driver of this crisis, but it's not exactly clear what that means for bankruptcy.
What are the kinds of frauds that DeVry and similar for-profit institutions were perpetrating that is like above and beyond just the kind of, I guess, moral fraud of your typical college saying, yeah, take out all these loans and get whatever BS degree, and yeah, it'll work out great for you. Like, what did the for-profit colleges do that is so much more egregious?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think to your point, it's maybe more a question of degree than like the specific facts of some of these cases, because, there is sort of the broader fraud of people being promised that, a college education will launch them into the middle or upper middle class, and then instead they're saddled with debt. I think in a lot of these cases, what you'll see are things like really high interest rates on the loans, or these for-profit schools basically advertising, okay, you'll go to school for free. And it turns out, of course it's not free, you have to pay eventually. And in fact, due to these really high interest rates, your debt is just going to explode. So I think that on the student loan side, it's a lot of misleading sort of advertising like that.
Yeah, and then some of them, they just shut down halfway through, walk away with all the money. Julia, great reporting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.